So I
That's
wanted to welcome folks to the session that we're doing here this evening on soil and garlic, presented by the Minnesota Premium Garlic Project and the Sustainable Farming Association. I'm Jerry Ford, and I'm the director of that project. And we have a farmer, very experienced farmer advisor with us who did one of our field days this year, Tom Coffman. Tom, why don't you give us a quick introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. I've been growing garlic in Dodge County, south of the Twin Cities, for about 20 years now. So prior to that, and during that time, I was working for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. So I've always kind of had an interest in soil and soil fertility and raising produce. So garlic farming's been good. I enjoy it.
Well, I always say we better enjoy it because otherwise it's a whole lot of work. So I'd like to introduce our main speaker for this evening. Carl and I have known each other for quite some time now. First got connected with the grandfather of Minnesota garlic, Joel Gerardin, probably 15 or more years ago now. And I'm going to let Carl tell you who and what he does for his day job and how he got into this garlic thing, all of that information. Carl, take it away.
great. Well, thanks so much, Jerry, and thanks for the invitation to be on the Zoom call tonight. Jerry said my name's Carl Rosen. I'm a soil scientist at the University of Minnesota. So my background is soil science, but I also have a degree in horticulture. Been growing garlic for about 25 years. I kind of got hooked on it after I got a call from someone wanting to know the soil fertility requirements of garlic. And I didn't even know at the time you could grow garlic in Minnesota. But once you get going with garlic, it's kind of addicting. And so I like to garden. And so I started with one or two varieties, and I think I probably have about 15 to 20 that I grow in 2 locations. But I get to talk today about 2 of my most favorite subjects. One is soil and the other is garlic, so you can't really beat that. Anything else you want me to say, Jerry, or should we start in on garlic soil requirements? And
just launch in, Carl, and then Carl's going to do a great little expose for us on the basics, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Sure. I'm just going to do the basics of garlic and soil fertility. And I guess the main thing I'll be going over are soil requirements. I'll go a little bit over nutrient requirements, and then we'll just kind of open it up for questions. But in general, site selection is probably the most important thing for growing a garlic crop. You want basically a well-drained soil. Sandy loam to silt loam soils are ideal, preferably higher in organic matter. Garlic, for whatever reason, tends to do well on higher organic matter soils, at least in the trials that I've run. The crop has a relatively shallow root system, so if you are on a sandier soil, you will probably need to do some irrigation if it's very sandy. But in most years, you don't have to do a lot of irrigation if you have any kind of clay, a little bit of clay in there, the loam to silt loam, in most years. Although I know Jerry did probably the first time did have to irrigate once or twice this year. It was very dry in certain areas. So site selection is very important. Once you decide where you're going to grow the garlic, I recommend always getting a soil test. Just traditional type soil test is the most basic test to get. So soil pH, soil organic matter, phosphorus, potassium. You can go into secondary and micronutrients if you want, but just the basic soil test is something just to know where you're starting off from. When you get your soil test back, obviously you want to take a look and do some interpretations, but one of the most important properties, chemical properties in a soil is your pH. You ideally want to be in a slightly acid range. 5.8 to 7 is ideal for most crops, including garlic. But I do have to say that garlic is tolerant of a wider range than that. But if you're definitely acid, I would suggest adding some lime. Higher pH soils, you know, usually not economical to reduce the pH, but you know, if you're really off, you might want to try it. If you're above 7, 8, or 8, that's a situation where you may want to try to correct that one. Generally, before you plant, a green manure, trying to get that organic matter up is recommended. Summer green manure, something like buckwheat, is a really good green manure crop, just as long as you don't let it go to seed too much. That's the one I like to use. So I mentioned soil pH is important. The reason why it's important has to do with its effect on nutrient availability. If you get too acid, you don't have efficient uptake of phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, some of your major nutrients. But if you get too high, you can run into some micronutrient deficiency. So that's why that sweet spot is just slightly acid, 6 to 7 or 5 to 7 is where you want to be for it. Okay, so that's kind of the basics there. Then we get into some of the nutrients. And of all the essential nutrients, there's 17 odd nutrients that plants require, 14 from the soil, but nitrogen is, of all those nutrients, nitrogen is the one that's most essential, or garlic responds to most. It's often most limiting for garlic. And based on the work we've done, I can say that garlic has a moderate to high demand for nitrogen. It will respond. And if you have about an 8,000 pound yield of garlic per acre, that's going to remove about 85 to 90 pounds of nitrogen in that yield. So how to determine how much nitrogen to apply? It depends on your soil organic matter level and the previous crop that you've grown. So our recommendations right now, and I guess I would say they're subject to change based on some of the work we've done more recently, but if you're in a low organic matter soil, we recommend about 120 pounds of available nitrogen. And as you get up to higher organic matter soils, anywhere from 4.6 to 19% organic matter, about 80 pounds of nitrogen. And if you're following a legume, you can reduce the amount of nitrogen because the legume will supply some nitrogen to that soil. So somewhere between 80 and 120 pounds is what we're recommending right now, but I have found that garlic does respond to nitrogen. So depending on your soil, what you've added in terms of compost and things like that, you may need a little less or you may need a little bit more. Something that you have to play around with. So in terms of sources of nitrogen, composted manure is probably the most common source used by growers. You can use non-composted manure, but you have to make sure you get that on in the fall. You don't really want a lot of fresh manure with the garlic crop, particularly if it's applied in the spring because of the potential disease problems that might occur, human disease problems. So composted manure is recommended. There are other sources. If you're, how many, just raise your hand, are organic? I assume most of the crowd's organic here, or so.
Natural.
Natural, yes. So yeah. I would say there are other sources of nitrogen, but they wouldn't be considered organic. Things like urea or ammonium sulfate, those would be for more conventional growers. But composted manure, different alfalfa, soybean meal, or just following a legume, something like green manure, something like alfalfa could probably supply, if you plowed that in, that would supply quite a bit of nitrogen as well. So garlic does respond well to organic sources of nitrogen. It's just amazing how well they do on those higher organic matter soils. Timing of nitrogen really depends on the source used. If you're using an organic source, it's probably best to put it on before planting and work it into the soil as you right before planting. There are other types of you can also go with foliar fertilizers and things like that that contain nitrogen, but that just supplies very small amounts of nitrogen. So don't rely on a foliar fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, to supply all the nitrogen. Make sure that you have the amounts needed prior to planting for nitrogen. Okay. If you lack nitrogen, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to get pale-looking plants, peaked-looking plants. The stems aren't as thick, and so if you have kind of a weaker-looking plants, it could be due to a lot of things, but nitrogen is one. So diseases will cause symptoms that kind of mimic nitrogen deficiency. But if you have adequate nitrogen there, you're going to have a much healthier plant. Okay, so once you have the nitrogen problem or the nitrogen fertility fixed, then you can go to phosphorus and potassium. Garlic has kind of low to moderate needs for phosphorus and potassium. You can base the application on a soil test. But if you're adding large amounts of compost, you're probably going to supply most of the phosphorus for sure, particularly if it's a manure-based compost. Potassium, you may or may not, depending on where you start out. Definitely look at your soil test for phosphorus and potassium, because that's going to give you a good need, a very accurate need of whether you're going to need to apply it anymore. If you do need phosphorus or potassium, make sure that you apply it before planting, because they are not, unlike nitrogen, which is mobile in the soil, phosphorus and potassium are relatively immobile and will not move downward. And so incorporating it is the best way to get it into that root zone. Okay, again, follow the recommendations on a soil test. That's probably the best way to do that. Then you have, those are your primary macronutrients. Then you have secondary macronutrients. Those include calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Generally, these nutrients aren't limiting in Minnesota soils. The only exceptions are if you're on a very sandy soil. So if you're on a sand, you might want to pay a little more attention to these. And if you're on a low pH soil, these might be limiting. So if they are limiting, just liming your soil with dolomitic limestone is a way to add calcium and magnesium. But as I said, deficiencies aren't very common, particularly on garlic, those nutrients. Sulfur is another secondary macronutrient, and it's involved with the kind of the flavor of garlic. So a lot of the medicinal qualities that garlic impart when it's eaten have to do with the sulfur compounds. So we don't really see any yield responses to sulfur, but I do think that if sulfur is limiting, you might have milder garlic. It might not be as sharp. There's really a lot of interest in how sulfur fertilizers affect garlic flavor and some of the medicinal compounds. We don't have a lot of information on it. In terms of yield, never seen any yield response, but I do think that over time, looking at how sulfur is involved with some of these secondary attributes of garlic might be an interesting project. And then you get into the micronutrients, things like iron, zinc, copper, boron, molybdenum. There's a whole host of micronutrients. Again, if you're using something like compost, you're not going to really see a deficiency in those micronutrients unless you're on a very high pH soil or perhaps a very acid soil. But I've not seen any deficiencies of micronutrients in garlic. So again, look at your soil tests, adjust accordingly, and kind of go from there with those. I think the main thing is to make sure you get your organic matter levels up. Use compost as a source of nutrients, and also a way to condition your soil, and kind of go from there. Couple of other comments about garlic in general. When you grow it, you'll see, a lot of times you'll see yellow tips, even in soil that has a lot of nutrients, very high in nutrients. So a lot of times the yellow tips occur before bulbing. We don't see, in most cases, doesn't have a drastic effect on yield. But the yellow tips can be a sign of nutrient stress or water stress or cold stress. I think this year we did see some cold stress. That yellow tips, a lot of the yellow tips I saw, I think had to do with very cold weather that we had this spring after the garlic was up about maybe 5 or 6 inches. I think some of that yellowing occurred from that. And sometimes disease can cause yellow tips as well. So there are a lot of things, unfortunately, there's not any one thing that say, yes, that's what it's due to, but yellow tips is something common occurrence in garlic that may or may not be due to nutrients. I think I'm gonna, how much time is it? So I've talked probably close to 15, 20 minutes already. I'm just going to open it up. Tom, maybe you have some comments, and you can make any additional comments that you might regarding soil fertility or soil management. And you might even want to talk about how you manage your farm in terms of fertility.
Yeah, and Jerry, you might want to chime in on this too. We're doing the Minnesota Premium Garlic Project, and we're doing some nitrogen trials with Chilean Nitrate. And so my nitrate test that first week in May was about, I can't remember the exact number, it was in the low 20s. And that last year I had red clover on that, and we plowed that down in August prior to planting the garlic in late September, early October. So I would have thought I would have had a little more nitrogen from that plow down, but apparently it either leached out, or maybe the soils were just too cold under a layer of mulch. The nitrogen wasn't available when we were putting that Chilean nitrate on. And actually the response so far, I mean, my garlic, I waited when I dug them so it was green, but it looked like about a 10 to 20% yield gain where I had the nitrogen put on this spring versus where it wasn't.
So does everybody know what Chilean nitrate is?
I just spelled it in the chat there for folks. It does come from the country of Chile, which is why we say Chilean.
Yeah, it's basically sodium nitrate, and it's the reason why it's considered organic is because it's naturally occurring, and it occurs in a desert, and it's basically from hundreds, maybe thousands of years of deposition of nitrate from the atmosphere. And it's so dry there that it doesn't dissolve, it just accumulates. And so it's considered a natural source of nitrogen. And that's why it's useful in organic farming. But
I just found out today that it's actually not approved for use in Canada.
So Chilean nitrate is not. Okay.
Right. You can't sell your garlic as, of course, anytime I've tried to sell garlic in Canada, it gets stopped at the border.
Yeah, I would.
I just stopped trying after a while.
Probably both ways too, because they have problems up there that you don't want down here either.
That's right. Well, Tom was mentioning about that adding spring nitrogen, and what we wanted to do field trials on was if adding a pretty substantial boost of nitrogen in the spring would impact the production of the garlic. The first year we did it, it was kind of a wash. It didn't really show that much improvement. And then we said, well, wait a minute, we don't know what we're starting with. We don't know what's in that soil. We didn't do a soil test on those test plots. So this time we did do those soil tests, and at least we have some sort of baseline to compare it to. But Carl, I'm going to have to ask you again, follow up on this. I had a test plot that had the highest level of available nitrogen in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more than what the garlic would need, more than those recommendations. Well, guess what happened when I added the Chilean nitrate and harvested it?
You got a yield increase.
I got about a 25% yield increase.
Interesting.
And then on my other plot, where it didn't have as much, added the Chilean nitrate, and it didn't see as big an increase.
Well, so there are other factors potentially going on. So in addition, so Tom, do you also, in addition to your red clover, did you use any manure or anything like that in your plot?
No, because I've used so much chicken manure in the past. My phosphorus and potash levels are extremely high.
Off the charts.
I don't want to put manure on anymore because of that.
Yeah, that's an issue when you use compost and manure. Over time, you're going to build up your phosphorus and potassium to very, very high levels. So a product like Chilean nitrate is good because you're only adding nitrogen and not any, well, you're adding some sodium, but you're not adding phosphorus and potassium, which can be very, very, very high with continuous use of manure and compost.
Well, let's see, at this point, let's see if any of our participants have any questions. Or are we just going too fast and using too many terms you don't know?
Can I ask a question about the cover crop again? You said buckwheat is
I like
recommended?
that. Yeah, I like that as a summer cover crop. You know, it grows quickly, get a lot of biomass, has a deep root system. It cycles nutrients from the lower levels up to the surface. So it's pretty ideal from that standpoint. The only negative is that if you let it go to seed, you'll have buckwheat in your garlic the next year.
You'll have it forever, basically.
Yeah.
Did you have more questions about the buckwheat, Kelly?
There are other cover crops you can grow besides buckwheat. A legume, well, red clover, like Tom had, is a good one because it's a legume, so you're adding nitrogen from the atmosphere naturally, and so you get that benefit. Whereas buckwheat is a non-legume, and you don't get any added benefit, added nitrogen benefit from a cover crop like buckwheat. It's mainly for carbon and organic matter.
Do you have a good source for organic cover crop seed?
I do.
Yeah, well, Albert Lee, I guess, is probably the best.
Albert Lee Seeds in Albert Lee, Minnesota. Albert, the name LEA, is an excellent source. Tom, do you use anybody else? Or?
No, they're very good. They've got a website, so.
And by the way, they're talking to me about finding 1 or 2 growers to supply their garden store with seed garlic for this fall.
Oh.
So potential market there for somebody.
There you go.
Yeah, they're a very good source. Now, I, more often than not, am going into hayfields. So that has alfalfa, clover in it already. It hasn't been worked up in quite some time. So it's the first time that a tiller or a plow will go through it. And then I know some people are going into fallow fields, fields that weren't really farmed or haven't been in a long time. Carl, is there anything you'd say about going into fallow or hay fields?
Well, again, just know what you're getting into. Get the soil tested. They could, depending on that field, if it hasn't been cropped in a long time and if it wasn't managed properly back in the day, it may be very poor in nutrients. So get it tested. Other than that, usually the nice thing about a fallow field that's never had garlic is you don't have any diseases yet. So that's always an advantage. You don't have garlic has a number of soil-borne diseases that can build up if you keep growing year after year. So again, you want to rotate. That's a recommendation that I would have. Sometimes you can get away with it, but in general, you kind of risking it if you don't have a good rotation.
So when we talk about rotating, I'm going to ask Carl, I'm going to say what I usually recommend, and then we're going to talk to the outlier, Tom.
Yeah, right.
I recommend not going back to the same place for 4 years with any other allium. Some people, it's like, well, I'll put mixed vegetables and they've got some onions and leeks and things in there. Oh no, that's basically causing the same sort of problems. So when we say 4-year rotation, it's like, don't plant garlic in that same spot for 4 years. That's kind of a rule of thumb. Carl, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, well, the longer the better, but you only have so much space, so much land. And so some people are forced to go with shorter rotations. In my backyard, I can only do a 3-year rotation. And yeah, it kind of works. I guess I don't have any major diseases, but I occasionally get some Fusarium now and again. There's certain varieties like the rocamboles. I just can't grow them now because of the Fusarium problem, but the other hardnecks seem to be a little more resistant than the rocamboles. So,
well, there's another study to do sometime.
Yeah.
What is a Fusarium? Which varieties are Fusarium resistant? And Fusarium is one of the most common, right?
Yeah, it's in all soils. And so I think if you keep growing in the same spot year after year, it'll build up. And there's ways of overcoming it by adding organic matter, getting a diverse microbial community in there. And so you get more competition. So if you do that, you might be able to get away with it.
Well, that's a great segue to Tom then.
If you've been adding a lot of manure over the years, that might help.
Yeah, and those, well, Tom, what's your rotation? Leading question.
Yeah, it used to be 3 to 4 years, and then as I got expanding, it's now down to every other year. And so, but what I've been doing, so like right now, I started harvesting July 16th and got done, I think within about 10 days. And just Saturday, I seeded annual rye, cereal rye, red clover, tillage radish, and turnip. And that's my cover crop for this year. And then next spring, what we'll see come through is the cereal rye and red clover. And then about in June, I'll mow off the cereal rye so that the clover comes through. And then by the end of August, I'll till that into the soil. And then I come back within a day or two of doing that, and I seed oats up on top of the soil. And then I plant my garlic into that. So even though I'm every other year with the garlic rotation, I've got a lot of different plant types growing between my garlic years. And I just think so far that's been working. I haven't seen any disease issues that's affected my yield any. So
when you do your cover crops, you're not really using that land for harvesting anything. It's basically you're just using it for a cover crop.
right,
It's actually a green manure.
right. It goes right back into the soil, and I think you mentioned fallow. Basically fallow is, my definition would be, you just leave the soil bare, you keep the weeds down, you don't plant anything for a year, and then you come back the next year and you plant something in it. I mean, they used to do that. They used to recommend that years ago, and now we found out when you do that, you've really kind of destroyed some of the soil biology, the bug activity in the soil. So you're better off. And they used to do the fallow to conserve moisture so that the crops weren't pulling water out of the land. But now they've found out that you're better off having something growing there to get that root activity in the ground. That provides sugars for the microbiology, and it's going to free up nutrients and give you a lot better crop if you've got an active growing cover crop prior to your garlic.
So Jerry, when you said fallow, is that what you meant? Something with no crop in there at all, bare?
Well, no, not really. And I know what Tom is talking about. And it's kind of when I use the term fallow in that context, it's like we have some growers who, well, I'm thinking of one in particular, new grower who did very well this year, and it was the family farm. No crop had been grown on that field for like 10 years. So it had
But it was probably in grass or pasture or something like that. Is that?
I don't think it was intentionally so.
Yeah, but there was something there that was being mowed or something.
Right. They had to go out and do some serious brush hogging and then mowing it down as much. And boy, did they build up a bunch of organic matter in that soil with that. And they had got a very good crop. So maybe I should use the term unused land or wild land.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, right.
So other folks, any other questions? Because I have a slew of them, so you have to butt in here.
I have a question for Tom.
Sure.
When you said you put oats and then you plant the garlic, do you still mulch, I assume, after you plant the garlic, or how do you do mulch?
Yeah, when I plant the garlic, I do mark my rows with a field cultivator. And then the oats are about 6-8 inches tall and kind of a sparse cover.
Sure.
But my thought with the oats is if I'm tilling down this clover in end of August, September is still a pretty hot month.
Yeah.
And I don't want my soil bare for a month. Before I plant the garlic, I want something growing back on that. So the oats are not a serious competitor with the garlic. They'll freeze off in November. And then after I'm done planting all my garlic in October, I'll come back and put straw mulch on top.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Carl, do you remember we did a little field trip up, was it close to Long Prairie? There was a grower up there who actually seeded buckwheat in the garlic.
Mm.
And he had the garlic growing. Do you remember that? I have a picture of you in that field.
Was I in the field?
Yeah.
Sure.
But he actually had buckwheat, and maybe I misunderstood it. Maybe he did what you said, made the mistake you alluded to, that he let his buckwheat from the cover crop go to seed.
Well, maybe, buckwheat is not winter hardy. So if you plant it, when you plant garlic, we'll get some garlic, some buckwheat. You probably won't go to flower if you're planting it late August, early September. The The biggest problem is you don't get a lot of biomass because it grows, you need warmer temperatures. It's a warmer season crop.
Mhm.
Doesn't grow that well under cool seasons. So,
Right.
but yeah, and it's also not winter hardy. Seeds are. The
Oh boy.
vegetation isn't.
Mostly I don't mind it because cattle will eat it, and
Yeah.
I'll
And
just
it's easy to weed too. It's kind of fun to weed. It's one of the nicer weeds to get out.
Well, one of the other sources that I've used a fair amount of for composted manure is a product called CPM, or composted poultry manure. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe Carl, you know something about this, or Tom, that it's that all these big poultry operations have to get rid of the manure. So they're making a product out of it, and I believe it's heated and then granulated.
Right.
And it's, what is it, like a 624 or something
Mhm.
formulation? So it's got some nitrogen, lots of organic matter, and it's cheap.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, some sources are cheaper than others. When we did our very first garlic project was, almost 25 years ago. We used a product called Sustain,
Mhm.
and that's a basically dried composted turkey manure, and it's mixed with turkey feathers and feather meal and things like that. And it works very well. That's a rather pricey product though. So if you can get one that's, maybe a little more economical, if you have a source of that, Jerry.
Yeah, I do actually. It's Midwest Bioag up in St. Joseph. Or I say up, here Wendy's up in Cook, and everything is down from her. So
Yeah.
you can buy it, have it shipped by the pallet load in 50-pound bags,
Okay.
or in totes, 1,000-pound totes, and it spreads real nice with just a small spreader, and is, I almost always now I go ahead and put at least some of that on, depending on what my soil tests have told me. And sometimes I'll just go ahead and put it on anyway. It's not going to hurt anything.
No, well, you will build up your phosphorus levels if you continually use that.
Yeah.
Like most other manure products.
Right. So of course, you folks know how to get in touch with me if there's questions about particular products or anything and sources. Of course, I'm happy to send you in the right direction. And I'm not obligated to prefer and to show no preference to dealers. I can say, look, go ahead and go buy it from this person. So what about compaction on soils? It seems to me that garlic needs a good loose soil in order to expand that bulb.
Right.
And sometimes fields, like if you've been driving a haybine over it for several years, or any number of other things, can get pretty compacted.
Right. So yeah, that's one of the nice things about adding compost or organic matter or using cover crops over time. That will help reduce that compaction. The tillage radish that Tom mentioned is another natural way of kind of opening that soil up a little bit more. I don't know how you plant, but I like to plant more in beds or kind of almost like hills, like potatoes, because potatoes like a kind of a loose system as well, loose soil. And, that helps. But I guess with garlic, like other root crops, there is quite a bit of soil disturbance, and kind of goes against, what principles of soil health in a way, because you try to minimize soil disturbance. It's really impossible to do with garlic, because just by the nature, you need to dig it up. Although if the soil is really loose, sometimes you can just pull it. So maybe you can, depending on your soil, but there is a little more disturbance with a crop like garlic than most other non-root type crops. But yeah, you're right. You do need a looser soil, and adding organic matter is one way of obtaining that.
Well, we talking about pulling up just being able to pull the plants.
Mm-hmm.
Of all of at our farm, we grow 3 porcelains, Music Armenian and German porcelain, extra hardy, whatever you want to call it. We had 3 of the over 5,000 of them, 3 plants that would not just pull out of the ground.
Oh, that's pretty good.
And fortunately, I had these teenagers working for me whose backs were a lot better at staying stooped over like that and pulling them up. But then we got to the marble purple stripe, Siberian.
Mm-hmm.
Had to dig every one of them.
Yeah, they have a much weaker neck. And then if you get into the soft necks, you almost have to dig them.
So I know that Stephen, you harvested in soil very similar to mine, this kind of Glencoe stored in heavy loam soil. How did yours come out of the ground? Was it pretty easy?
Mine were a little bit easier than yours. We have a little bit more of that Darwin sand. For those of you that know our area, there's a little, they call it the Darwin sand pit. So we have definitely some sand, or sandy soil too. So yeah, ours pulled pretty well, compared to when I got to help you out the other day.
Yeah, Stephen saw some of that firsthand when he came over. But Tom doesn't actually grab the plants and pull them up. You have a different way of doing it, don't you?
Well, Jerry, I can't because they won't come out. It's I'm in a silty clay loam, and it used to be mapped as a Floyd or a Clyde. Now I think they call it a Marquis. We've got some Casson and Kenyan soils here. Silty clay loam over a dense clay till. The ground's too hard. If I pull them, they'll break off at the right on top of the bulb, and especially with the soft neck. So I have to lift them with I use a middle buster, a big sweep on a middle buster, and I got to straddle each row and drive with the tractor and lift them, and then come back and yank them out and shake the soil off.
And there's about as many ways of harvesting and as many different kinds of soil practically as there are garlic growers in this state. There's a grower out west who actually uses a bucket on a skid steer, and he comes in from one side of the field and comes under it with the bucket, lifts it up, backs out, and then his kids come along behind, and once they finish that row, they start the next one. And talk about disturbing the soil. But they can get the garlic out pretty quickly. So any other questions, folks?
This isn't about soil, but do you ever have problems with rust on the greens?
Rust? You mean the diseased rust, or
Yeah.
like wheat rust or things like that?
Yeah.
So rust is not a problem here. I've seen it before on some garlic, but it's not anything that I know out in California, rust can be a huge problem on garlic. But out here, I've not really seen it as a major hindrance to growing the crop. So
That's good news.
yeah.
Yeah, we have
other ones to worry about. things like nematodes and let's see. I guess that's the main one. I also haven't seen much white rot here.
No.
It's one that doesn't really occur.
I was reading about white rot out east.
Hmm.
And of course, they seem to get everything before we do. They got the garlic bloat nematode out in New England
Yeah.
before we did. Now they've got the Allium leaf miner,
Oh, yeah.
which is an actual little insect. Before we were dealing with microscopic things. Well, that Allium leaf miner. And last report I saw, it had moved into Pennsylvania. So it's headed this way. Oh boy.
Hopefully it's not that winter hardy, but we'll see.
We did see a bunch of growers reported to me Anthracnose in the scapes.
Oh,
this
the
year.
scapes. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And a lot of people call it twister. The scape will come up and then it'll start to deteriorate and twist and turn orange and fall off, and you lose the scape. Rarely affects the whole plant, but a lot of people are selling the scapes here. So that was kind of that was the one that made its appearance. And I wanted to give you a quick example. I talked with a grower 2 days ago who just kind of came out of the woodwork. I'd never heard of them before, and they were just selling some locally. And this year when they went to harvest, their garlic had like one skin on it, one layer of wrapper, or none. And there were cloves, but they weren't inside of a skin. And so I went down the usual suspects. Haven't really heard of that one before. I said, "What's your rotation like?" And there was kind of crickets chirping for a little bit. And they'd been in the same spot for 6 years straight.
Mm.
I said, "Well, I guess your luck ran out
Hmm.
with that one." But I'd never heard of
So-
bulbs had no skins on them.
Did it have nematodes or something, or what was the?
It didn't look like it. They sent me a picture, and you always look at the root base.
Yeah.
I have seen I know of 2 cases of the garlic bloat nematode in Minnesota this year. Hopefully that is the only ones. But if I can preach at you just for a moment, when you buy your seed stock this year, please ask for the test. And if the grower you want to buy from did not do the garlic bloat nematode test, then come back to me, and I'll even ask Carl and Tom to advise me and say, okay, what questions do I need to ask them if they didn't do the test? It's just something you do not want to get into your soil because it'll just stay there. Okay, anything else? We're coming up on 5 minutes till the hour. And,
Do you
Oh,
ever
we-
sell, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Do you ever sell green garlic before it bulbs out and dries out?
I have not sold it, but there is a grower. Last I heard, he was still doing this. As a matter of fact, he's pretty well known. Terry Ninich is
Oh.
with Extension, and he was growing. I at first it just baffled me. He was growing. He's way up in the northwest part of the state. Garlic in high tunnels, and I was like, "Why are you taking up that valuable real estate in your high tunnels when garlic will do just fine outside the high tunnel?" I mean, they grow it all well on up into Canada, up the Red River. And finally, he said, "Well, I'm not selling bulbs." He's actually selling green garlic, like I guess it looks like a leek or something. And he did. I mean, he sold quite a bit of it. So yeah, that is a market. I've just never. I just like to see big bulbs.
I think, well, I don't know. I guess you can space them closer together or something, but just seems like I'm not sure how that pencils out relative to, more traditional way of growing the garlic.
Yeah, and your seed cost.
yeah, you got the seed cost, and maybe yeah, I don't know how that works.
Terry had all his own seed. So,
Yeah,
um,
I see.
yeah, so he was kind of penciling out that cost.
Yeah.
But no more here. And I know you've just come in from California, Kelly. There's getting to be a pretty good market for scapes here. I don't market them myself, but I have two people that love to come and pick my scapes for me, which is a win-win situation. And one of them is making a scape pesto, and the other one is selling it to the co-ops and the restaurants. And I get rid of my scapes.
I think as the word gets out, there's going to be more of a market for scapes, but just people don't know what to do with them right now. But there's only about a 2 to maybe 3 week window when they're available. So if you get enough people knowing about them, it should be a market down the line, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think all of you know that the reason we take off the scapes is it increases, especially in the porcelains, purple stripes, those kind of hard necks, it increases the bulb size.
Right. Yeah, especially those porcelains.
Mm-hmm.
They will be very small if you don't take the scape off.
So if I heard you right, Carl, most of your nutrients, especially nitrogen, you want to get it in the fall before planting.
Well, yeah, I think if you're using an organic source, or by organic I mean a carbon-based organic source. Sodium nitrate, even though it's considered organic, is very, very soluble and probably has a higher salt index than a lot of the other fertilizers that we use. So that one you can put on in the spring, and with water it just washes down and gets to the root zone.
Right.
But anything top dressed in the spring that's has carbon-based organic is not going to really get into that root zone very quickly.
And does that include the foliar, like fish emulsion?
Well, that's a little different. Those are kind of, those are going to get in through the leaves, and I think there's some other benefits of those. I think that maybe aren't really related to the nitrogen, or maybe some growth regulator type properties to them. And, yeah.
Great.
So,
Well, there's certainly some growers in Minnesota that swear by their foliar fish emulsion in the spring.
I've tried it before, and I mean, it definitely has a nice kind of sweet smell to it. And I don't know, Tom, do you use any foliar on yours?
No, I don't. No.
But after the last two springs, or the last two harvests, Tom and I are both like, yeah, that spring fertilizing with the nitrate, Chilean nitrate, might be a pretty good idea. Well, I'm going to give it one more round of field trial.
Yeah, see how it goes. Yeah.
And then I may work it into my whole system to get that on it in the spring.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're right up at the top of the hour. And you can, of course, send me questions in the future, and I can forward them on to Tom and Carl, or I'll just make up something myself. And otherwise, you've got the little symbol there for clapping hands if you want to, or you can just, I'd like to thank Carl for spending time with us. We're one of the luckiest states in the country to have head of a soil science department in a university who's a garlic head. And then, of course, Tom, with his vast experience in growing and his background through extension and all in soil science, is greatly appreciated. And you were going to say something else, Carl?
No, I was just saying to thank Tom as well. So did that. So that's great.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Thanks very much, folks. And we'll hopefully you can get prepared for harvest, and we'll roar into the fall.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation again. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Carl.